I'm going to do a little quick intro to this panel series. TR Talks is meant to be a way of building community with people that are applying research and knowledge towards health innovation. This series is sponsored by three key institutions and with the U of T. One of which is the Health Innovation Hub, which you will hear more of, I hope, through Paul, so I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on it specifically today. The other one is the Translational Research Program. Some of the students are here tonight with us. And the third one is a new one that we're developing with some of the departments within medicine, MyTO. It's sort of the hub for translation. The idea is that one of these is an educational degree, one of these is a loose-knit researcher community, and they all sort of feed into Health Innovation Hub, which helps to commercialize and deploy the knowledge that we generate. So I'm really excited to hear some of the discussions today, because what I will tell you is I met Gabriella about, I guess, 6-7 years ago now, and we decided to do a little teaching together. And right before the first class, she sends me the slides she's prepared. There are only about 90 of them for an hour, and they're in 3-point font. And it was like reading a textbook on screen, trying to scroll through it. So I wrote her back saying, well, this is really fabulous and I've learned a lot, but I'm just not sure that this 3-point sort of font is conducive to actually reading on a screen. So she pared it down to 40 pages before the class for 1 hour, and that's how we sort of started working together. And you'll hear Gabriella introduce each of our panelists, and they each have really deep experiences with intellectual property. So I'm going to sort of prime you and start. This is about you guys engaging with them and each other. So really take the opportunity to voice and ask questions, because I'll tell you that there are sectors that claim that intellectual property, IP, protecting these sorts of rights is useless to business. Look at Google and look at these software companies where if they don't get a product out in 6 months or less, from development to the shelves, then they're going to be facing new platforms, new hardware, new issues. 6 months after they've released something, they need to be working on something new. The shelf life is over. So what's the point of patenting something that's going to take you 18 months or 3 years? What do we need intellectual property for? Who does it really protect? So these are some of the issues that I hope that you will engage with. And so I'm going to throw this over to Gabrielle. And I should also introduce her as a faculty member in the TRP, one of the mentors and the lead legal consultant to the Health Innovation Hub, and also a PhD, and I'm sure many, many other things that I keep forgetting. She's one of these underachievers that has lots and lots of accomplishments on her CV.
Thanks, Joseph. So for our panelists today, we have Dr. Brian Courtney, Dr. Paul Santerre, and Mr. Tom Wattell, and they will each introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do currently and a little bit of their prior history.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Courtney. I started off as an engineer. I did computer engineering at Waterloo. And while I was doing computer engineering, I decided I wanted to apply my skills to an area that might be of social benefit. So I started targeting my technical skills towards the area of medicine. After doing that in industry for just over a year, I decided I want to learn more about the medical side. So I went to do a master's degree in California, did a master's in electrical engineering. And while I was there, I decided I want to do medical school. So I was in school till I was 40 years old. I did interventional cardiology, I did general medicine, cardiology, interventional cardiology. I'm currently on faculty at the University of Toronto as a clinician scientist. I'm a practicing interventional cardiologist at Sunnybrook and have a research lab there. I've also started up a few companies. I started up 2 medical device companies in the Bay Area in the area of cardiovascular medicine. And when I moved back to Toronto, started up another company. It's called Connaught Medical. It currently has 90 people that work for it. We have 2 products for imaging inside the heart that are cleared by the FDA in the United States and approved by Health Canada. And we're just making a transition from a company that's done a lot of research and development to get to patents that have been issued and regulatory clearances that have been provided, and some early initial sales and human use, and now we're trying to go to larger scale manufacturing. So a lot of people that work for the company, probably 28 people in research and development, 40 people in manufacturing. And this all got started as a result of some patents that were developed at Sunnybrook with a large cohort of other scientists and physicians that I work with. And I'm probably a co-inventor on the order of 25 to 30 US patents, and probably 110, 120 patents around the world. So I've been in the IP space for a little bit and been able to act on it and commercialize some of those technologies.
So I'm a chemical engineer by training. Have actually never formally held a faculty position in engineering. No, first I was hired by the Department of Surgery at the Ottawa Hospital, Ottawa University, to work on their first total artificial heart program. I was the materials and packaging manager and ultimately became the systems engineer for that product and technology, which converted to a company called World Heart Corporation, which was a very interesting learning experience in the world of startup activities and melted away very fast. So we learned by falling in the mud quite a bit. And I was recruited here to the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Dentistry, where in the Department of Biomaterials there, and then ultimately became cross-appointed into the Faculty of Medicine through the Institute of Biomaterials and Biomedical Engineering. I've been involved in 6 companies over the year, four of which I've been responsible for initiating, 3 which are still very active here in Toronto, a company called Cohesis, which was a consortium partnership with Sunnybrook Hospital and the University of Toronto here. So when we talk about intellectual property, the relationship between cross institutions brings very, very unique aspects to consider. A company called Interface Biologics, which I established with a few different patents back in 2001. It's still very active, beginning to start to sell some of its assets off, and we've recently just spun out a company called Ripple Therapeutics. I'll be on the board of Ripple Therapeutics. I'm still Chief Scientific Officer for Interface Biologics. With all that experience in the tech transfer, I became co-developer for the Health Innovation Hub, which today has some 120 companies in it. Last year, those startups generated about 20 million, and that was from 5 years ago when their net revenue was 40,000. So we've been growing, doubling those numbers per year since then, and we already know this year we're going to well exceed that 20 million. And these are young entrepreneurs, very much like yourselves, that are doing things very similar to what Brian has described here. In addition, I run a research lab out of the Ted Rogers Center for Heart Research across the road in Mars, which is a translational effort. It was actually a $265 million effort to fix broken hearts with a big focus on technology translation. So I brought a lot of what we've learned on building companies and considering how do you start to look at science, how do you protect it, and how do you move it off the bench as fast as possible out of the hands of public institutions, which typically have not been designed to successfully run companies, as I'm sure we'll talk about later on during the evening.
My name is Tom Glaudel. I'm also classically trained as an engineer in mechanical engineering from McMaster. And then I did my graduate work at Waterloo, also from mechanical, but it was in the field of microfluidics and lab on a chip. And from there, I spent about a 8-year career currently in startup, med tech, and biotech companies in Canada. I've worked for Stem Cell Technologies, which is out in Vancouver, developing products for stem cell research, particularly around using magnetic nanoparticles for separating specific cells. Then I came back to the GTA, where I'm originally from, and I spent some time for about 2 years moving from scientist to assistant director of research and development at Exogenic, which was developing a molecular diagnostic platform. Spent a couple years there. Then I went to another company, which is my current employee, which is Relay Medical, where I act as chief science officer. There we look at taking different innovations in medicine or in health tech, kind of incubating them, providing either capital for them, as well as know-how and expertise on the engineering side to get them to a point where they could be spun out and further commercialized with more capital. As well, on the side, I'm involved in assisting a number of startup companies in the Waterloo area that are either in medtech or biotech. And I still do a little bit of academic work. I serve as an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. I have a research project going on still there with my old supervisor. So over the last few years, I've had a lot of experience with IP, specifically at Relay Medical and in my time at Stem Cell, where as part of my work, I would evaluate a lot of different opportunities, like different projects we might license in, different technologies we'd want to invest in. So figuring out the value of the IP as well as the business opportunity and how to commercialize it is something I've been working on for the last few years.
Thank you. So just so we understand where you're coming from, have any of you filed any patents? All right. Do the rest of you hold any IP? My students better know this answer. You should all be raising your hands. Copyright, everybody owns copyright, remember? All right, so because we talk about IP in this abstract form, I thought it'd be a good idea to actually understand what the forms of IP are before we dive into the rest of this. So it's been mentioned several times here. The number one piece of IP that people are familiar with is patents. What's another one? Copyright. What's the third one? Trademarks. All right, those are the main ones. There's plant breeders' rights. There is integrated circuit topography. And the last one that people qualify as IP, but it's actually confidential information, is trade secrets. Okay, so with that, we'll start again with, we'll build on the question, but what was your first experience with IP?
My first experience with intellectual property was when I was involved in an invention competition at Stanford. Stanford had a, can you invent a better solution to this particular clinical problem? And they had 15 people submit their ideas, and then the people who got first and second place had their patent fees paid for by the university to move it forward. And so we came up with a way to connect blood vessels during open heart surgery fairly quickly, a procedure called anastomosis, where you join two blood vessels together, and we came up with some ideas around that. It was actually an incredibly complex idea that we came up with, which is why we got second place, not first place. But there were a lot of novel things that were involved in that established some prior art for a number of things in terms of how to visualize things inside a beating heart, how to make quick connections, how to do things without interrupting blood flow and doing off-pump bypass surgery. I think looking back on it, there were certainly a lot of, it was an ambitious and creative set of intellectual property that was put forward, which is probably why no one patented it before, because I'm not sure it would work perfectly, to be honest. But that's how we got our initial, that's how my team got our initial foray into it.
So my first foray with intellectual property was during my postdoc at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. I was recruited on a part of, I had a little bit of independent time to do my own research, but most of the time was on this artificial heart program, which was a consortium with St. Jude Medical, which is a fairly large medical group, which I think has now been acquired by Abbott. There you go. So, but at that point in time, it was a pretty big deal. It was a $20 million project. It was a research project in a university run by a company. And so they started exposing the whole group to intellectual property. And that was first, not only for me, but for many of the senior PIs who were involved in the process of that. So that piece went fairly well because industry had their hands on it. They had their industry, intellectual property, legal folk teaching not only us, but teaching the intellectual property office of the University of Ottawa how to maneuver and strategically develop IP, how to plan patent fencing, which is a strategy for protecting not only what you have, but ensuring that nobody else comes in your backyard and displaces it. So in those 2.5 years that I was doing my postdoc, I was exposed to all this. And during that same period, I got my first research grant. And out of that first independent research grant, we immediately moved towards generating intellectual property concepts. And in fact, those concepts were ideas that were subsequently patented within a year of coming here to the University of Toronto, and resulted in the formation of Interface Biologics. It was their first technology that led to their first clinical products, which were PICC catheter lines that are now used all over the world and turned into be pretty important financial result for the company this past summer.
Yeah, my first experience would have been, I think, in my first job outside of school. I had developed a bunch of innovations that helped my first company, Stem Cell, improve various aspects of their cell separation technology. And because it had an immediate, like, a business value, then that's when I first got introduced to the concept of actually patenting something. And it turned out that those patents are still in prosecution, and that's almost 6 or 7 years later. And I mean, one of the benefits of that company was that they had an internal legal counsel that took care of all of the patent writing, knew the strategies. So other than providing them with like the core IP, the ideas, they were in charge of structuring the patents and obviously coming up with all the strategy. Then when I looked back at it at that point in my first job, which was maybe within a year, I realized that there was a lot of work I should have patented in my graduate work that instead I published. And at Waterloo, there's a very favorable situation for people who'd like to patent as part of the faculty or as part of the students in terms of ownership of the IP. So if it's a really great idea and you think it have commercial value, which is the key, it's worth considering it even in your graduate work.
All right. So next, building on that, what do you wish you had known about IP before you dove into it head first?
You know, there have been a lot of things that I've learned as I've gone through writing intellectual property. You get these moments of fear where you think you've spent a long period of time trying to come up with a unique idea that is inventive, novel, and non-obvious. And you hope that you're the first one to have the idea, and you hope that no one else has patented some aspect of what you're actually commercializing that would ultimately prevent you from doing that. Because it's important to know that patents are a negative right. They're the right to tell somebody you can't do that, right? And so if we build something that we get a patent for, but we're reliant on something else that someone says you can't do that because some aspect of your technology is protected or owned by them as a right to claim, then it can get a bit scary. And I would say probably once a year, I would bump into a patent of some sort that either on first blush might put some concern out in terms of whether or not the patents that I'm filing are patentable. In other words, not anticipated by something someone else has put out there previously. Or even worse, that I might lose freedom to operate because someone got some incredibly generous claims from a very non-diligent examiner in a jurisdiction of importance that basically said, hey, even though you started doing this thing 10 years ago and someone else filed a claim 5 years later that says you can't, that they asserted it was their invention, and then by right would be able to tell you you can't do that, you then have to think through, all right, a lot of panic goes off, a lot of sweat happens. You've got a lot of people who invest a lot of money and your own time into this kind of an effort. And you have to go back and take a look at the lay of the land and figure out, all right, is that going to be a valid patent that they can enforce? Or is there something unique that still allows your patentability to stand up, whether it's the freedom to operate or the patentability question that you have to address? And so I've learned over the course of time that if I did a good job initially up front of doing the prior art searching, of finding out what else was out there, if I truly think that what I came up with was non-obvious and I bounced the idea confidentially off of enough experts, that when these issues arise as the patent is maturing or as the technology that's dependent on these patents is maturing, not to freak out too much, because there's probably some way or path forward in order to overcome some of the challenges that have been raised. And so I've learned not to get too anxious about these things as they do arise. They inevitably do. There are a lot of people in the world come up with ideas all the time. You can't possibly know all 10 million issued US patents and their contents and the intricacies, neither can the patent examiner. So just having a bit of a calm approach to things. It's a bit of a roller coaster, and you have to make sure it doesn't take you for a ride, but that rather you're fairly calm as you go through the process.
I think that's a pretty reproducible experience for me, tackling the non-obviousness, and I'll come at it from a different angle. I wish I'd appreciated the whole scope of non-obviousness. I'd wished that by the time I came to the University of Toronto and started patenting my own work, that our offices and experts in this area who were guiding us had appreciated these elements, because back in 1995, when we pursued our first patents on surface modifying technology, which, as I said a minute ago, turned out to be a really good bonanza for interface biologics, we were told, you patent the world. You write this gigantic thing and try to grab everything you can do. And when you do that, you run into obviousness. The broader your arms are, when you go after claims that you do not necessarily have examples for, but they would be obvious things to think about. As soon as you put that in writing right there, you now invite yourself to that knowledge to run into other knowledge that is in these other 10 million patents are out there. And even though what's in the literature has not come really close, because you went and grabbed so far out in that first patent, 7 years down the road, when you discover the cat's meow, the thing that really works, the thing that really is going to make money, because of your broad claim and those peripheral other claims coming from other patents, the combination of those two things creates an obviousness in the eyes of the examiner, and you are no longer able to protect the cat's meow of what's really going to make you money. So I spent, I'm senior science officer for interface biologics. I spend most of my time for them now helping them protect their patent portfolio. My first 10 years was learning some very harmful lessons from having gone too broad on those earlier claims. I spent most of my time now defending myself against my own patents, not defending myself necessarily against what was out there. And if I had been more strategic at the beginning, claiming what I thought I really could claim at that point in time and held off, I might have had an easier ride with some of these other pieces of IP. So that was a 10-year lesson. I'm pretty good at it now. I keep these guys out of trouble, and it's not something that's obvious until you're in there and see it.
Yeah, freedom to operate is always something that's typically not done by many inventors at the very beginning. They don't appreciate the importance of doing a prior art search and really getting a lay of the land before they decide that it's patented. In some cases, probably one of the negative situations I've seen is that somebody had a pretty good idea for a health tech startup, and they submitted a patent, obviously trying to keep the costs low, so they forgo the prior art search. And then they submitted, and we were looking at trying to maybe take that technology in. I mean, I spent maybe 3 or 4 hours just glancing through some search words, and I found exactly that technology patented already. And you're like, okay, that's not great for them. But there's also the situation where somebody has had a patent and it's a good idea, and they've not maintained the patent over the years. And so now it's not enforceable. And for many startup companies, one of the early assets is having some sort of protection for a little bit of that time, especially in health tech where you have a 5-year development cycle before you might get into any revenues, 5+ years. And it's really hard to raise money if you don't have at least the potential monopoly there in the future. So that type of poison pill or poisoning the well by having an abandoned patent sitting there that would be useful, but now nobody can actually use it as an asset. And so it doesn't allow for somebody to invest in that idea and develop it further.
So just a few points of clarification, because we've been hearing from everybody a number of things like freedom to operate. So I thought that I would just clarify that for those of you who haven't been in my class and should know this already. So freedom to operate is basically the exercise you do in figuring out what's out there. So there's an adage that just because you get a patent doesn't mean you can do anything with it. There are patents for methods of exercising a cat out there. So for a freedom to operate analysis, it basically means that if your patent were to issue, can you actually put a product on the market, whatever your product is, or that technology that your patent protects, can you put that on the market? And sometimes the answer is no, because your piece is only a piece of a larger whole. And in order for you to be able to put that out there, you actually need to license the other components from somebody else. And sometimes the licensing fee is a steep few $1,000,000 that's prohibitive. So you could have been spending $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 on a patent that you just got, but you didn't do your due diligence in your freedom to operate exercise, and now you're just left with a check, and you have to pay the lawyers, and you can't do much with your technology. Joseph? Well, what do patents protect? I hope that wasn't one of my students. What do patents protect? Inventions. Okay, ideas are a dime a dozen. So there is a new wave now because of some of the cases that came down from the Supreme Court in the US that have steered away from patenting certain things, especially in computer-related and technology-related areas. So the new model is much more of a hybrid thing between a patent where you can disclose certain things and that becomes public. So it's in the public domain and you have it for 20 years with the right to exclude others. As Dr. Courtney said, it's a negative right. But the meat and potatoes piece, the meow piece, sometimes it's kept as a trade secret. And a trade secret is only secret for as long as everybody keeps their mouths shut. And so you don't want to put that out onto the stage. So you wouldn't want to disclose that kind of information in a patent because that comes back to patentability. And certain things are no longer patentable. And so you have to have a strategy about what you're protecting and what the best way is to protect it. Joseph. Well, as we talked about with the dead and abandoned patents, who's actually going to invest millions of dollars to put anything on the market when they have no control over it? You know, everything's available to everybody, so it has to be organized in such a way that you have a stake in the ground, and as everybody on the stage can attest to, the investors into your company will be asking you how many patents you have and how well are they protecting your technology. So it's important to really think through what that is, and the business strategy should really drive your IP, not the IP driving the business strategy, although in academia that happens more often than we care to admit. The other piece is prior art. So when you're issuing or you're granted rights, IP rights, they're territorial, meaning that if I'm filing for a patent in Canada, I have patent protection in Canada. If I want to have patent protection elsewhere, I need to file in every jurisdiction that I want to have patent protection for. Now that's completely the opposite of prior art. Prior art has nothing to do with territoriality. So if somebody in Timbuktu has a piece of technology or information that the patent examiners can find, and that is prior art against you, it's prior art against the novelty of your idea. So yours is no longer new because somebody else has already put it out there. So that goes against your patentability of new, useful, and non-obvious. All right, so just to clarify some of those. And then we'll move on to, okay. What was your biggest IP challenge you face, and how did you overcome it?
For me, I think there have been a few instances where there will be 2 or 3 that I'll share. One of them is when you're going out and you're raising money, it's always a bit of a delicate balancing act. The ideal situation is to start off this whole process with $1 billion in your pocket and to not have to tell anybody anything and be able to fund it on your own. But the downside, or the reality, is that very few of us have that potential to do that. And so you need to go out and share your ideas with other people for a number of reasons. One, to make the idea better, really, really important. I think the best ideas involve collaboration from a number of people. Number 2, you need to attract resources in order to move your idea forward. And by virtue of the complexity of the fields that we operate in when you're doing medical technology or biotech type research, these are inherently complex and highly competitive areas. And so you'll get invited to meet a lot of people and say, hey, come over and talk to us about your thing, or I know this expert over here. You know, there'll be Mr. or Mrs. Megabucks who has the money, and they have a good friend in another part of the city that they want you to go and meet, and you think they're benevolent, and you go and you share your idea fairly liberally with them because you're excited because you think there's a prospect of getting the funding that you need to move things forward. You know, I've been burnt by that once or twice, where the next thing you know, maybe to Mr. and Mrs. Megabucks' ignorance, that other person is working on a competitive project for someone else. And I've seen patent names, patent inventorship show up on a few patents that got submitted shortly within a month or 2 of the conversations that took place. That then created problems for subsequent patenting, not for what I might have disclosed at that time, but almost giving someone else a head start on something that was of value to the team that I was working with at the time. So I think being careful from that perspective, I think, is really important. Have confidentiality agreements, and even more importantly than that, talk to people that you think are trustworthy and credible. And do your due diligence, and hopefully you don't have to do too much sharing in order to get what you need in order to move to the next step. The other thing that comes up fairly frequently is you might think that you came up with a great idea and you looked at it and you looked at all the US patent literature or all the European literature because it's in English. And occasionally you find stuff in other parts of the world when you start filing claims in other parts of the world and get your stuff translated, and then the examiner in that part of the world starts doing searches. And then you have to go back and say, maybe the claims that I got back in the English-speaking parts of the world where they didn't have immediate access to that know-how that was out there published, that might work against you if you're working on a patentability issue. Might actually work very well for you if you have a freedom to operate issue, because that doesn't matter what language something is written in. If it's out there and it's public domain, it can be used to invalidate something that came in afterwards. So those are a few lessons I think that I've got that I might stop there.
Joseph, you want to jump in?
Well, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here who's not asking questions. So from what I just heard, basically, is we don't have to worry about IP until we go to see Mr. and Mrs. Richbucks, and there's no problem. So why should we be concerned?
So for the reason that Gabrielle explained, so let's think about medical technologies in particular, right? Because there's the whole information communication technology sector, and if you focus mostly on data and algorithms and web pages and apps, then maybe there isn't a whole lot there for IP because it just moves so quickly that by the time you get to a certain spot, it's obsolete. With the caveat to that being that maybe if you're the dominant player and you own a whole bunch of data and you have some very proprietary algorithms, those might be so valuable. The neural net that you get from that might be so much more valuable and effective than what you would get if you were to start de novo 10 years later. There would just never be an opportunity to overcome the barrier of entry in that area. That's where a different form of IP that wasn't mentioned earlier kind of takes place, and that's in the data and the understanding of the network of how to make decisions or process that data. But you know, when you look at a device or a drug that interacts with the real world, and you look at how long it takes to develop it, how long it takes to get it approved, how long it takes to set up manufacturing processes for it, how long it takes to do the distribution for it, the conservative number is 5 years, and the realistic number is 10 to 20 years. And if you don't have something to protect it in that time period and generate additional IP as you go forward and you encounter the problems that are not addressed by the initial set of IP to then further extend the runway, then you know all you're going to do is basically shovel someone else's driveway and then let them drive out of the garage. You need to, if you don't have IP to tell somebody else, you know what, I'm shoveling the driveway, but I'm just driving my car in and out of the garage, then you're just doing favors for other people. And people love to be fast second followers. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot easier, it's a lot less painful as long as they have the rights to do that. So of all of the sectors I could imagine, I would think that medical related technologies is the area where intellectual property is perhaps most valuable, just given the inherently the regulatory aspects, the complexity, and the time it takes to move these things forward.
All right, so there's two questions on the floor now. There's Joseph's and Gabriella's. So do you want me, Ms. Chair, do you want me to start with yours? Challenges. So I think it is very challenging, and this is not just for me, but in watching the companies that we help build out of the Health Innovation Hub, for you to truly sit down and think about your business plan and what's important in your business plan. And you said it a minute ago, I think, Gabriella, let that drive your intellectual property strategy. Once you identify your invention and what it could be, most inventions could be many different things. Once you start combining ideas, it could go here, here, and here, and here. But where is the true business opportunity? And spending time, it takes a lot of work to spend time early on to study that very well and to construct your patent fence around that business opportunity. That is truly what you want to protect it, and you want to protect it for the reasons that Brian just described here. It's going to take several years to do that. It's going to take money invested in clinical studies, and you may do some pivots after you have your first pre-meetings with the regulatory agencies that may define new pieces of IP. So once you do that one patent, you have to understand that it's a living strategy. Patenting is a strategy around a consortium of inventions that are focused on your business plan, and that takes hard work. It's not something that's just the end result of a few experiments and then we're going to go run out and we're going to write a patent, we're going to submit it, and all done. Now move on. It's an ongoing element. So from a technical perspective, that's what I find very, very challenging. How do I look in my crystal ball today and understand that the day I'm ready to go on to market with product 10 years from now, that I've done the right protection along the way to ensure that that is secured. A different type of challenge that I face as a coach and mentor to companies in an academic ecosystem like we live in, and this is worthwhile talking about given that we're in the group that we're in here, is a general frustration that most inventors and entrepreneurs have, particularly in a country like Canada, where our public institutions are custodians of knowledge for society. The taxpayers contribute to giving us good hospitals, contribute to giving us good academic institutions. The taxpayers' dollar goes to tri-council funding to fund grants that allow the work, that create the discovery. So at the end of the day, the intellectual property that emerges out of that effort has been funded by the public. And the public has given the responsibility to public institutions to be custodians of that knowledge and allow that knowledge to move out and impact the public. And I think at this point in time in the process, our public institutions have confused the role as custodians of public knowledge and versus their role as owners of that knowledge. They're not owners of that knowledge. We are mere contributors to enabling that knowledge to happen as a result of a very social, public investment in the betterment of our societies. And our institutions have a role to play in ensuring that that technology, that knowledge, moves out of public institutions as fast as possible into the hands of companies like Connaught, Interface Biologics, stem cell technologies and whatnot, Canadian companies that can hire Canadian people, that can generate product for people around the world. And so one of the frustrations I have, one of the challenges I have as a mentor in coaching intellectual property to coaching our young inventors on their intellectual property is trying to enable them to negotiate reasonably with our public institutions, many of which believe they should own 50% of a company as a result of the fact that the research has been done in those public institutions, when in reality, your first negotiated deal in a business-to-business, when you own a piece of IP, if I partner up with a big manufacturer of a catheter, for instance, it's a good day if I get 10% on the royalties of that product. 10% of the net revenue that comes out of that could come back to me as a company. But our public institutions starting point is 50% of something that they will not even be involved in the go forward, i.e. the corporation, the activity of the corporation with regards to turning that into a product, which is the reason why we patent stuff. We patent things because it's going to take 8 years, 5 years of very hard work from a corporation to build a product that will have value. And so I spent a lot of time trying to convince the leadership of public institutions that the game has to change if Canada is going to be competitive on the marketplace.
And for the people who are in the audience who are students or looking at where they want to work, taking a close look at the intellectual property of the institutions that you are at and seeing if it's compatible with something that you think would be worthwhile for the ideas that you might want to move forward with is an important consideration, because you won't get to negotiate that many times in your career.
And I would concur that one of the challenges of the IP, if you're an industry, is that you assign all of your IP and inventions to the company. And it's something that if somebody does research and is a scientist and likes to come up with new innovations, sometimes it's a tough pill to swallow. Exactly like I was saying it, yeah. And it's happened to me a couple times where you're sitting there and you wish there was some sort of royalty in your contract that would come back to you. Of course, it's not in the favor of the company, and in most cases, employees are not in a negotiating position to ask for that at the beginning. But it is something that when you're in industry, that if you're inventive and you're doing science, you're going to give away a lot of your ideas, and it's something to consider also if you go into industry. Another challenge, I think, if going back, is that idea of like whether something is actually worth patenting. And when someone patents something, a lot of inventors are so enamored with the idea that they never step back and see whether this is an idea that actually can serve as a platform to build a business, or it should just be licensed right away. You're better off just selling the patent and the IP rather than trying to go through all the work of starting a company, because very few single patents, good patents, will provide many potential product lines down the road and many potential options for a company. If it narrows you into a specific device or one little design, it's unlikely that it's worth starting a whole company around, and you should look to just try to license it to somebody, a large player.
So on that topic, what percentage of patents in a startup portfolio do you think are useful? I guess. Open to you.
I think it really varies. You don't really know which patents are going to be useful until probably halfway through their lifespan, right? They're 20 years, and it surprises me how many, I think, when I reflect back on them, actually got incorporated into products. They seem like great ideas. You're not sure which ones actually defended off people out there that otherwise were thinking of taking a stab at you and entering into your field, and maybe you held some people at bay because you built an adequate fence around related technologies to what you're trying to do, that you could actually preserve a commercially viable area to develop from. So I think probably most people would probably give an answer of maybe 10% as being the ones that they would really truly hang their hat on that were central. But I think there's more to it than that, because you probably wouldn't have gotten that one. It's just a little bit like what the VCs do, is they invest in 10 companies and they hope that they make it all back on 2 of them. And you're crystal balling things. So when you're writing intellectual property, you don't know how valuable it's going to be. You don't know how well it's going to stand up in the future. And sometimes you get surprised. The thing that might be the small feature improvement that you thought was kind of an add-on actually ends up having a lot more of a critical nature, or being a lot more strategic in value. So I think it takes a bit of experience to decide what's worth patenting, when does it get too expensive, and yet what is enough to have an effect that gives you enough of a runway and enough of a defense to be able to go forward and build value into whatever entity the patents are going into.
Absolutely. So the stats are somewhere between 5 and 10%, and it's true with startups, and it's true with large companies too. And then there is that aspect of defense patenting, where you just patent certain things, not necessarily with a startup, because the investors want you to stay focused on one thing and carry that through. But larger companies have entire portfolios of defensive patents so that they can keep other people at bay, or they can just enforce licensing, sue them, or just force licensing revenue from those patents.
Yeah, if that 5% is which is the patent that is actually tied to the individual product that's generating the revenue, then yeah, down around there. But in terms of strategic patents, I'm with Brian. You try to push the fence out as far from if your ground zero is here, you try to have as many patents that keep people as far away from that lucrative value add, and that's what will keep that lucrative value add being so valuable when it comes time to sell it off to a bigger corporation or whatnot. They will be looking at how big that fence is as much. So it's hard to put a dollar value on that, but there is a value to that. I think I have probably about 70 to 80 patents, and I would say there are roughly about 5 that have generated cash. I point to that one, but I know there's a bunch of other ones that have been critical in keeping people at bay.
And it's not just defense, it's also preserving some areas where you can grow in the future. You're not sure which ideas are going to be best to work with in the future. So it's also having it's not just to keep other people away, but it's actually to preserve future opportunities and to convince investors that you can actually go onto those opportunities without being competed upon. And sometimes it's actually about preserving freedom to operate, because you might patent something that you that you think is small, but then you end up building out the product and evolving in a certain direction, and then you find out that someone else actually patented something at some point that might potentially have blocked that iterative change that you wanted to make. But if you're broad enough in your initial patent set describing all the various ways of actually doing something, you actually preserve that freedom to operate by virtue of the fact that it's a published patent that predates what someone else might have tried to do, which is a form of what's called submarining in the IP space, to block you from making an important incremental change to your technology.
So we're coming up to time, but I will have two more questions. One you've already touched on, and that is what the best way is to get IP out of these institutions if you start a company.
I've spoken a lot and I already answered that question,
Yes.
so I'll pass until
I'm not sure if we actually we identified the problem.
I want the solution.
I'm not sure if we gave. Well, you did say. I mean, negotiate up front as you come in. This is what I'm planning to do at your institution, and this is the terms I'm proposing. And you may have that luxury, or you may not have that luxury. Depends how much weight you're carrying coming in. The average academic, the average young academic doesn't have that kind of clout. Brian came in with a very unique package: engineer and clinician and inventor. So I'm sure Sunnybrook really wanted him. So he had negotiating power. But yeah, you know what? I'm going to have to do a little bit more thinking about the solution, because I'm still working on the solution. This is a real world problem that we're now actually talking. We're just in the process of, just so you know, the University of Toronto is very, very close to a concept of having a blanket license of not asking for more than 5% of these startups and keeping very, very low single-digit royalties, which is typically the realistic world, but it has taken a very, very long time to get there. The only thing that they're struggling with now is how do I justify the resources that I'm putting into this effort. They know it's important. They just need to be able to figure out how to justify the resources to get there. And I know several of the hospitals are just really beginning to toil with this concept, and I'm not sure how far along they are. You came from Waterloo, so they just give it to the inventor. I mean,
I believe, yeah, they have total control over the
Yeah.
ownership, but it's still, I believe the fees have to be paid back eventually with royalties. Whatever
Yeah.
royalties are
I think
accrued first go back to the university.
And I think most institutions want that. Once you start making money, the deal is you'll pay things back. But there's kind of our MIT of Canada, the Technology School of Canada, and it's saying, as a public institution, why will I hold on to this? Why not give it to the individuals who are going to drive it? But there are far and few. I don't even know if there's another institution in Canada that just gives it flat out to the inventors and lets them.
I'm not sure.
Run with it.
There are a few other inventor-controlled, inventor-owned. They tend not to have hospitals associated with them.
Yeah.
But there are a few other inventor-owned academic centers in the country. So what you're referring to is what's called a rapid express license, where there's already a preset term of what the licensing might potentially look like for something that comes out. And that's, I think, one thing that's helpful. I think another thing that's also helpful is to look at where you're potentially getting hired to see if they have examples of other people that have done things successfully, to see have they moved ideas forward. Are some of the people that are on the senior leadership team of an entrepreneurial bent, and would they understand what it's like to be in the inventor's shoes or in the entrepreneur's shoes? Or are they more of a bureaucratic and political nature where they want to say they've owned as much of the IP as possible within a particular institution? And so that's one way that you can kind of sniff out what might be a friendly environment and what might be a less progressive environment for intellectual property purposes.
One of the strategies that has been successfully used by several of our companies that have emerged out of H2I, and I see it over at the Creative Destruction Lab as well, is that just appreciating the roadblocks that are put up there, trying to bring advocates on their boards early on, individuals who are in positions to talk to directors of research, to try to help on the negotiation process to create a reasonable set of terms. So that might be something that you could do from that perspective. More, I'll finish this point, just Joseph. More globally, one of the things that people, more senior people can do on campuses who want to free up elements of this is to try to help our institution understand the payback down the road. If you have a successful spin out, like a stem cell technologies, for instance, and whatnot, that has done very, very well, and was enabled by a lot of intellectual property with reasonable terms from a public institution, a company like that is going to will remember. That particular company is a very strong ethics. They will remember where they got their start, and they will be their donor for the universities. They will be the employer. I mean, that's a company that has employed many HQP, highly qualified, professionally trained individuals like many of yourselves here, and helping the university think systemically about the process. This is not just an event. This is not just a negotiating event that's happening in 1 hour, in 1 year. This is an investment in society from many different perspectives over decades. And that must be the bell telling me that I need to listen to Joseph. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to comment on something that you said, Paul. Where do you go? How do you solve this? Have we presented a solution? And it's probably true that you guys haven't actually given a very clear solution. And I think part of the problem is that whatever you mention here today, if you even had the best way as a student or a researcher or part of our community to protect your IP, whatever was said on the stage today would no longer be true in a week or a month or a year. These policies, both on the hospital side and on the academic side, are being reworked and rethought, and they are changing. So the way I wanted to connect that is that the best thing you could do is go out and talk to people in the field that are experts that you can trust. One of the best, in my biased opinion, ways that you can do this is to approach something like the Health Innovation Hub. The address, the URL is down there, h2i.utoronto.ca. The Health Innovation Hub does not take any IP. They are agnostic. They do not take any portion of your company. They are there from the very beginning. If all you're looking for is just to figure out a little bit of stuff about what it means to be entrepreneurial, right on to when you start having a commercially viable idea through to a company and then scaling. And so because it's one of the, and this is where I was hoping we could go deeper, the campus-linked accelerators, there are now 11 of them. The Health Innovation Hub focuses on health, and they have the philosophy of no wrong door. So if you go and you approach them and you get mentorship and advice and you find there's somewhere else you want to go, you're perfectly welcome to do so. It's the mission of the Health Innovation Hub is to help you develop your ideas and protect them and forge them into viable commercial entities. So it is one of those safe places, and perhaps legal counsel over there could say, where you can share. It is governed by the university policies, and they don't take any equity in anything you do. Is that fair to say, Paul? As one of the...
I think I should give you a % raise.
Wow, that's amazing.
So before we turn it over for questions, parting thoughts about and advice to new, freshly minted entrepreneurs for success and no fear of failure.
IP is one aspect of it. There are a lot of aspects to it. So I think team building is a really important one. And the best place to start forming a team is around when you're actually building the core IP. You'll get a sense from what the contributions everybody are in terms of how effectively they can generate new IP, how well they work in terms of communication, in terms of taking on responsibilities. It's a big project, and so you just want to make sure that you're working with people that are able to contribute on terms that are fair and productive with you.
I think my advice to you is to network, to talk to a lot of experts, and to use the new resources. There are a lot of new resources that have come into the library in the past 5 years that allow you to do that freedom to operate, or early freedom to operate on a free basis. Do that, acquire that information, and have those conversations with those experts. The networks are growing very fast. They're very large. And to Brian's point, these are complex elements, and you want to do them collaboratively. You should do them. You should not be discouraged from doing them because they're complex. If they were easy things to do, everybody in this room would own a company, and they have a ton of IP. They're not easy, but their impact on society is huge, and that's very important to pursue.
Yeah, I would recommend that if you're looking at trying to do some new IP or start a new venture, is to make sure you ask a lot of questions, try to pick a lot of people's brains, and don't be discouraged by being challenged. I mean, sometimes inventors are discouraged by having someone challenge them, but it's a stress test that's necessary, I think, so that if you can convince somebody who's challenging you to see your side, then they're going to be fully invested, and those are the type of people you want with you, because it's just the start of the journey, and it's going to be a very long journey, requiring a lot of money probably and a lot of your time and effort. So it's worth seeking those types of challenging situations.
Absolutely.
Just one last one that I forgot. It comes back to speak on a comment Brian made about 10 million. An analogy I love using in talking about intellectual property with our startup companies is that there's 8 billion people on this planet. We have evolved to be a pretty intellectual group of individuals, despite what we see happening in the world today when you turn on the news. So the probability that this brilliant idea that you've had has not been thought up by some other poor soul around the world is really low. Is really low. And try to humble yourself on that thought as you start this process. And if you do that, then you will work very, very hard at doing the kinds of things that were described with regards to doing your homework.
And my counterpoint to that is there are only 10 million patents that are issued. And if you think of all the permutations of thoughts of interesting, useful things that you could bring to this world, it's several billion. So at the same time, there's a big open space as well.
And keep in mind that just because you get a patent, you can't necessarily do anything with it. So there's that. But to pivot on something else or build on something else Brian said about teams, don't stick with homogeneous teams. You need a diversity of backgrounds. The more you have, the better you are. Homogeneous teams, when it comes down to pivoting, are flat-footed because they just don't have the expertise. There's only so many hats each person can wear. So the more diverse your team is, the better it is as a team and going forward. And the most likely you are to actually attract funding. And with the funding component, as they all can attest to on this stage, you need to be coachable. You can't be a know-it-all. You need to be willing to listen and take criticism, constructive or sometimes not as constructive, but just show yourself as being somebody who absorbs information and processes it, rather than saying, oh, this is my invention and I know best how to do everything with it, because that is actually a very common thread in a lot of young entrepreneurs who are very convinced of their own intelligence and powers, and that can be very off-putting to investors. And with that, we'll turn it over to you for questions.
I'm just a little bit curious about how you communicate the value of your intellectual property, especially surrounding clinical trials to investors or potential investors.
The clinical value of your idea or of a clinical trial?
The value of the data generated in a clinical trial.
Yeah, you don't so much patent the clinical trial results, but you patent the idea that you did a study around. Is that what you mean?
I'm more curious about how you communicate the value at what stage of a clinical trial you're in to investors. I do understand that you filed a patent, but after you've brought a drug to trial, for example, how do you communicate the potential success or failure to an investor?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to do it. You can look at the overall market size for a technology. What's the size? What's the solution potentially worth? What are some comparables in terms of other drugs? What do you anticipate that the adjustment in quality adjusted life years might be, and multiply it by the population of people that actually have that condition in order to justify a potential cost effectiveness ratio? And then you can discount the value of that idea over the course of the 10 to 15 years it might take at a high sort of interest rate because of the risks involved in terms of getting it that far. That's kind of one way to do it, but I think most people will ballpark it. I think most people, when you just have an idea and a concept that you're moving forward with some very early ex vivo data or early prototypes that you couldn't use in a preclinical model, ballpark people are going to say that this is maybe worth a few $1 million, and then you raise $1 million, and then that dilutes the company, but then you can move things forward. As you get to later stage things where you have a product that's gone through regulatory approvals, it still is shown to have value in terms of improved outcomes, then you're typically looking at upper tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of value at that point. And it really varies a lot, not always by things that might be rational, but by what's kind of hot or fashionable of the day. It's kind of like selling a car. So it's what something's worth what people are willing to pay for it. And so there tend to be more people willing to pay for things perhaps on the drug side, drug discovery side, than there are perhaps on the device side. There are people, interestingly, willing to pay a fair amount for particular healthcare data plays, in part because it is a faster turnaround time in order to actually get it to market, and it's not as regulated. But in terms of coming up with the value of something, that's a very sort of long and very specific question to each particular idea, the environment in which you're marketing it, and how successful that idea is.
The only thing I would add there is surprisingly, well before you'll run that clinical trial, you'll be thinking about market segmentation and where your product is actually going to work and have the greatest potential for being taken up. Typically, a technology such as a new drug would have great potential to be taken up if the particular segment of population have no cure. Nothing exists for that particular individual. Versus if you're now coming in with a new drug and you're kind of a me too, or you're just off of a me too. There's 3 other options out there. They're okay, they have their own side effects. Your drug is different, has different side effects, and is marginally better. It does not mean that that those clinical data will actually translate into a displacement on market. And these are the kinds of things that investors will look at as well. So it's a great question, but it's not a clean answer. There's not a clean answer to it. There's many tenets to it.
It's actually an interesting paradox where a lot of orphan diseases or solutions for things that are relatively small populations are actually getting valued very heavily these days. And some of the things that are treating some of the really big things, like some of the more common oncologic conditions or cardiovascular disease, it's actually harder once you develop that technology to get reimbursement for it, because the governments are so scared about paying an extra $1,000 for every patient who shows up with a heart attack in the country that it actually gets hard. You end up being discounted by probably 70% if you have something that is broadly applicable, because then it requires a lot of change from a lot of people in terms of guidelines, in terms of education, and in terms of the dollars that represents to the healthcare system, whether it's in the US and Canada or elsewhere. It actually becomes a little bit slower to make that change than perhaps some of the more niche areas. And the idea or the argument that people will say when they say, well, we're going to invest in an area that's on this very particular niche platform, is that we can then take that same technology used to develop this new drug or this new device, and then we'll move it over to another set of areas that are much larger. And they kind of use the foot in the door technique of negotiating to get good pricing or good valuations, help them raise money at an early stage. Whereas if you say, I'm going to come out and I'm going to, cure heart attacks or prevent heart attacks, it gets a lot harder because it's such a common condition.
And I also would add to this that if you get an idea of something which makes the treatment easier or cheaper, that's also very tempting for a big investment.
Yeah, it has to be, it used to be that if you came up with something that was a good idea and had better outcomes, that the US market would pay any price for it. That's no longer the case. It now has to be easier, cheaper, and more effective. It almost has to hit all the value points in order to be able to get adopted in many, many circumstances.
Hi, what are some of the steps that an early stage startup can take in order to protect their IP from other giants in their space? Because these big companies have the resources and the financial thing to, sort of take your idea and build it in their space. Like, what are some of the steps that an early stage startup can do in order to ring fence their idea, IP?
I mean, outside of actually getting the patents, I mean, that's the point of the IP, right, is to protect you from getting bullied, essentially, by larger companies, which they are known to do. They will try to bully smaller companies, which they know they won't have be able to withstand the legal costs of defending their patents in the long term. And so, I mean, if you can get a patent with whatever resources you have available to you at the moment, that's probably the best strategy. In general, though, for large companies, patents are not exactly that expensive to attain. I mean, $100,000 sounds like a lot of money, but when you have revenues of $1 billion, it's a drop in the bucket. For a startup, it's obviously very expensive, or could be expensive depending on how much capital you have. So, I mean, that is the purpose of protecting startups early on, especially in the healthcare, health technology sector, is because of the long development times. IP is almost critical to having a successful startup and raising money.
The big companies are a bit more vulnerable. If they infringe and they are successfully found to have tried to infringe something, you'll probably find a lawyer who's willing to help you prosecute on a contingency basis because they know there are big pockets to go after. And B, the judge will probably saying, hey, this is clearly egregious, patent infringement and bullying, and that's what the patent system is there for. And the United States has something called triple damages. So if there are damages and it's a willful infringement of intellectual property, they automatically have to write whatever the damages are determined and multiply it by 3 and award that to the people who own the intellectual property. So if you want to think of a cost-effective way to protect intellectual property, file a provisional patent, which is a very early stage patent with the US Patent Office. It gives you a 12-month window. And then as soon as you hit the end of that 12-month window, file in the US and also file a PCT. That buys you another 18 months before you then have to start paying for national prosecution and translations and all that kind of stuff, because that's when it gets really expensive if you're filing in multiple jurisdictions. Provisional patents, if you're comfortable with doing it, it can cost you $3,000. I'd recommend spending, if you haven't done it before, I'd recommend spending $10,000 or $15,000 on it. But if you've done it several times over, you can get away with it for $3,000. So.
Yeah. So I mean, your first step is to definitely patent, and the pathway is this. It keeps that knowledge hidden for 12 months. Nothing, actually 18 months if you go past and do the conversion. 18 months. If you don't do the conversion into a full-blown patent, then you got 12 months where you have that. Secondly, make sure that you understand what your business plan is. What is the real focus thing that you're interested in protecting? That is really, really key, because you want to ensure that is properly protected when you go into with non-disclosure agreements. You want to make sure that is sealed, so that then you have a big legal arm to the opportunity of a legal arm to go after them if you're infringed. The reason why you want to understand what your business plan is, because you do have to be thinking about that patent fencing that we talked about, big corporations have no problem, as was just said, throwing down $100,000, $200,000 and just patent everything around it. But if you're really cognitive of what your business opportunity is, then you will be astute at thinking about what do you need to protect during that process of non-disclosure. And you got to learn to read your partners. You got to find great partners. There are a lot of honest people out there. For as many, people who just want to take advantage of you. I've worked with many great companies and individuals who certainly had the capacity to run circles around us, but that was not their intent. So really take time to get to know your partners that you're starting to play with, and ask yourself if they're really the ones you want to play with. We have a tendency to want to meander to the big guys on the block, that they are the best partners. Quite often, they're not, in the early stage, they're not your best partner. Your best partner is a small company that has an asset that you need, and you have an asset that they don't need, and that you both mutually understand that you need each other to survive, to be able to make it to the big play. Take some time to explore who those partners truly could be, who those early partners are, to create more and more value down the road. Because the more value you gain on that technology, the more difficult it's going to be for the bigger players to go after you, the bigger players to steal it from you.
So I will add that your first and greatest risk is before you patent anything, before the provisional, before anything else. Be careful who you speak to, and be careful specifically about speaking at conferences and the whole disclosure issue that we talked about in class, because that's when you have people in the audience that have light bulbs going off, and they will go to the patent office and patent things right from under your feet. So you have to be very careful about what you say, and it's one of those stuck between a rock and a hard place. You have to disclose to get funding, but you can't disclose because you haven't filed a provisional, which you can't file because you don't have funding. So you're in this hamster wheel all the time.
So I told you that my first venture was a result of an innovation competition. But that was where you put everything in a sealed envelope, it goes to a trusted group, and they've signed off, it's going to be confidential. The worst thing you can do is say, we're doing an invention competition, and we're going to have everybody stand on the stage and talk about the invention in front of an audience and have it recorded and broadcasted on the internet so we have broad coverage. That is the absolute worst thing that you could do. So you can only want to do anything even remotely close to that once there is something written and filed in an office somewhere.
It's a bit provocative question. Reflecting on what Paul said about public institutions being custodians, keeping all IP generated by public institutions. We all know the concept of open source software, when in IT industry people can use the code and build something based on what has been done before by community of developers. Potentially, the same thing we can see Elon Musk recently given all his patents to the public, what has been developed within Tesla. Why, that's just a question for discussion, why don't we think about using all this intellectual property developed in public institutions as an open source thing, which everybody can take and use to build something on it and bring value, and that would be the value which investors can evaluate, not the patent or IP, as we call it itself.
I think Elon already has created enough of a fort around what he's doing in terms of know-how, momentum, infrastructure, and in part that move is a great move to. His biggest issue is not, I'm worried about other people competing with electrical vehicles. His biggest issue is, I want electrical vehicles to be more broadly used and available, so there's more infrastructure for people for charging stations, better batteries, et cetera, that he would want to have access to as well, so he can sell more of his vehicles. Plus, it's a great marketing move. Like, the marketing value of that is just as good for not only Tesla, but also for his own personal reputation and his personal endeavors going forward to do something of that nature too. But I don't know if it's practical. I don't think it's practical for medical technology company or to do that, to take intellectual property from an institution and then try and get investment into that, but have it be free art, because you're going to be learning, you're going to learn things it's going to cost, and you won't have that major advantage that maybe Tesla and Elon Musk have currently that makes it easier for him to do that. And what do you think, Paul?
I concur. I mean, I think he has great momentum. The problem with our public institutions is a complete disconnect with reality of what the intellectual property is worth today in its raw form as created and just submitted, when nobody has created any added value to it, the pathway of that additional value. That is the missing concept. There are perhaps some jurisdictions in some areas where free and open approaches to discovery are valuable, particularly in the gene and proteomics area where there are unique formulations, very, very unique formulations that will take years to find and define, and there'll be other opportunities to patent and protect stuff around there, as opposed to shielding the whole genome. And I think you've seen this in the field, right? That many biologicals are not patentable. Okay, the unique therapeutic use and its unique dose and things like that is, and so therefore there still is value in pursuing intellectual property in healthcare. But where the mistake is made by our public institutions is the value they attribute to that very initial knowledge that created the IP. And if we can get them to understand that, there will be all kinds of innovations going on out in the public and companies and great things. We'll see great things.
Yeah, and on the not only overvaluing is probably a lack of appreciation of the risk associated with doing any venture startup, right? I mean, people who have capital need to have some sort of life raft to hang on to at the very early stages when everything is very, very risky. You have people that might be coming in and out of the company. Obviously, key personnel are always important, but that system introduces so much risk that I think sometimes public institutions don't appreciate just how perilous it is very early on. And so it does provide a valuable
I think there's another dimension to this. I'm a big supporter of open source, open access, in terms of approaching. But if you think about it, it's sort of apples and oranges. When it comes to things like trust, open access and open source software or initiatives have issues with having branching and different kinds of innovations by the community, which is why many corporations and other people choose to go with something like Microsoft, because they know that's their product and they're going to stand behind it. If you think about it in the parallel in terms of health science, if everything that was produced from public institutions was just given out willy-nilly, and then anyone can claim, well, my company's safe because I'm using something from institution X, there may be issues of trust, or maybe issues of how do you know they've done their due diligence and move forward. And when it comes to healthcare, that's kind of a dangerous place.
All right, we'll take one more question, and then we'll open the floor for mingling. One more question.
So it's a little bit of practical question. I don't know, maybe it's for Gabriela, maybe for gentlemen from industry. So let's suppose you are a private company that invented something, medical device, and have to go to the hospital or university hospital to test it. And it's 100% that the people from this institution will give you some advices, some suggestions how to improve your device during this testing. And of course, nobody would like to give the equity or the rights to the IP during this testing study, and how to protect yourself, how to put the border from the beginning in a legal way between your partner and your company to protect your invention from being sued in the future for using someone else's intellectual property. I mean, these advices or suggestions that were given during the testing. Thank you.
Well, I'll start off by saying that you'll need a very good agreement, a collaboration agreement, to ensure that if there is joint development or joint IP with regard to improvements that is done between you and whatever entity you're participating with, that is joint IP. And how that's sliced is a whole nother kettle of fish, and joint IP is one of the most heavily negotiated pieces in a contract, because you're basically splitting up the baby before the baby's even here. So it's a bit backwards, but so people either leave it and say, we'll just deal with it later, which is not necessarily a good thing, or they get mired into it so deeply that it just grinds everything to a halt. So there has to be some fine balance between how you actually apportion that and what joint actually means. And as everybody here can attest to, joint ownership is a giant mess. You try to avoid as much as possible. And beyond that, when it comes to the practical pieces, I'll turn it over to these gentlemen.
I think your question was, company X has product, goes to a public institution, wants to have it evaluated. I would work as hard as possible to ensure that you do not jump into joint IP ownership with a public institution, because public institutions are not going to move that technology forward. The company is going to create the value down the road. And so you handle this by doing what Gabriella said, and that is you have a contractual agreement, and you discuss who owns the data. And you should always be trying to negotiate that you're owning the data. Now, if you don't have deep pockets, you have to give away something. And so now you could go down that pathway of joint IP, but my recommendation with a public institution is not to do that, is to go down the road of giving them a percentage of royalty or something like that, that's a lot cleaner. Because you, as the corporation, you want to control the destiny of that intellectual property down the road. Down the road, you're going to want to sell it or have a partner with somebody, and the last thing that you want is a bunch of bureaucrats from public institutions trying to tell you what to do, because as we've already noted a minute ago, they just don't appreciate the risk that are involved for you as a company.
So to build on that joint IP piece, very true. So the way you get around it is, if they insist on joint IP, you also insist on including some provisions there that says something to the effect of the IP is licensed exclusively to you. So you have control. If they're not in a position to assign it to you fully, the best idea is it's developed jointly, but their piece of contribution is assigned to the company from the get-go.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the clinical trial agreement is important, and it's more important to do that, especially if you're doing your first few sites. Let's say you're doing a multi-center randomized controlled trial that's going to have 100 physicians that are involved in testing the technology on 2,000 patients. You will not be able to control whatever IP comes out of that. That's just too complicated. But most of the value in terms of the new IP parts will generally come out at the earlier parts, where a lot of the challenges with the technology are coming out, or the drug are coming out at the very beginning stage. And that's when it's probably more important to be careful about it. And you can remember, that entity is the one holder of that technology. It doesn't have to go to one single hospital or one single institution to do that study. It does have the opportunity to talk to several institutions to say, like, are these terms reasonable? Are these investigators that you're working with, are they interested in having a piece of your pie, or are they interested in doing what ultimately hopefully got you into the space, which is to say, I want to make patient care better? And so, and if they do make valuable contributions, everyone who makes a valuable contribution should have some way of being recognized for it, because these are going to be smart people that you're working with. So just being creative, realizing you're not locked into one site to go to this, and that hopefully the tone and the experience and the history of the groups that you go to do that early clinical demonstration or collect early clinical data is one that is known to be a productive one that has fair terms, and you sort it out in that clinical trial agreement.
Thank you.
I can add to this because I have done that. I have worked with company who wanted to test certain devices. As the person you want to work with, there's always, like Paul said, the institution in between. They have a lot of paperwork to go through, but normally the company gives it to their lawyer, and then the other lawyer looks at it, and then you can come to an agreement. But like everybody said, do it in the beginning so that there are no misunderstanding also from the academic or hospital side.
Well, with that, we'll let people mingle. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for sharing your insights and experience.